Yes. What's your name?
Valerie Herrera with the City and County of Denver.
Oh, very nice to meet you.
My question, I have two for Kiki. So going to the live-work component, I was just curious if there's been any conversation around perhaps limiting the types of commercial uses that go in, or if all commercial uses require these type of fire requirements, or if you could think about like limiting a list like a home occupancy type of use, or more lighter, more sensitive uses that may not require all of this other.
So the issue with the fire department is that you have two separate people doing separate things, not communicating with each other, and somebody downstairs could be doing something dangerous, catch the place on fire, and the people upstairs not aware of it, you know, potentially trapped in the building.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter, it's actually, you have to have the same person with the same brain as far as the fire department's concerned. They just don't like two brains in the same building without having separate buildings.
Very dangerous.
Okay.
It's an interesting way.
These things get hot.
It's killing people.
But
It's
People are
killing
dropping like
people.
flies.
But if I could add too. So Longmont, we adhere to the International Building Code. Well, the International Building Code is a model code. And so every year they add, or every other year, they add new provisions for the worst case scenario they can think of. The challenge is how local governments could take the time to really weed through that model to determine what is really problematic. The unfortunate thing is organizations like Longmont, they don't have that built-in capacity to create their own codes or modify those codes necessarily. City and County of Denver, for example, they have their own codes. They actually have totally different codes.
We got two.
Yeah, well, they do use the IBC to some degree too. So it's really funny, for example, in Aurora, certain, just simple things like a sky bridge, we couldn't get done there, but they could be done in Denver. And the reason is because Denver had said in their evaluation, no, that really is not problematic relative to our environment. So I think that's part of the challenges. And then the other part is too, you've got several people reviewing the code. So you have the fire marshal reviews his section, and you got the building guy over here reviewing his section, and planners over here saying, hey, we want to get this nice live-work thing built. What can we do?
And I will say this one thing, Chris Allison was the head of the building department in Longmont. He would write variances and exceptions to the IBC for the city council to protect my development. And so if Chris Allison were still there, he would put something in there so that we wouldn't have a problem with this issue next year. When they put in the no code. So, you know, that we did have people protecting and enabling and helping us do what we did. But you lose, I mean, after 25 years, they start retiring. So
But I have a question. So you're in the city, and well, my house is a 3-story live work that has, in that particular year, you were not required to have fire sprinklers in that building type. Now you are. You go on, and every year it gets more and more and more. And I just sort of wonder, like, why not just pick a really fantastic year like 2000? 1990. You're like, since 1990, it's been a pretty safe world. I haven't heard of any, like, you know, human building caused deaths.
A bridge just fell down in Miami not too long
Well,
ago.
everything was fine until they allowed the fire marshal to be involved in plan reviews, is basically what happened. So.
The building codes, I mean, it's just more expensive, it's more expensive, it's more pain in the ass.
Yeah.
that's a problem, it gets more expensive.
Right, because the sprinkler system's like thousands and thousands of dollars to install, so.
It's not outrageous, but
I mean, we can't build historic neighborhoods in any of our cities
Right.
now. We
Yeah,
couldn't
codes
build
don't allow.
what we have anywhere across the United States practically,
Should go to
thanks to our
Greece.
code. But if you look, what neighborhoods hold their value the most? What neighborhoods are the most desirable? What neighborhoods have been walkable for 100 years? It's those historic neighborhoods.
So how many here know the Highland Gardens project? The old Elitches at Tennyson and 44th. Okay? It's a new urbanist type development. So I worked with the city and county of Denver at that time, and I was actually the neighborhood planner assigned. So the developer goes in, he actually draws up plans with the exact same street sections on the peripheral. and got hammered, and actually had to widen the streets out, I think upwards 2 to 4 feet, just to get the approvals. And the reason being, oh, and one thing I forgot to point out, I had the little fire truck up there. The one proverbial misconception is that fire trucks cannot go into reverse. Right? There's a big belief about that. And that was the reason, because the fire department said, we can't possibly get our fire trucks through those streets. And it was put back on them saying, well, what about the other 80% of the streets in the city and county of Denver? And they're like, that's another problem.
So I'm going to use etymology, I'm getting off track a little bit, but fire trucks could not go in reverse back in the teens and the 20s, 100 years ago, because they used reverse to drive the water pump. So it evolved from that.
Okay, so it's just kind of developed into their mentality.
That's where they start.
That's funny. One thing that you had mentioned, Brad, was that you had seen a 15% growth since 2010 in population. How many housing units have you guys added in that same period of time? And how many were people like me who had their burgeoning career smashed on the rocks in 2008 and had to move back in with their parents?
Well, I don't know about that.
Are you still there?
No, but seriously,
I would say that, I don't have the exact number
Right.
per se, but I say it's been split between a couple of very large multifamily unit projects, say 300 units plus, which for a town of 35,000 is a pretty big, change. And some smaller multifamily, so fourplex to 20, 30 units, that type of thing on fairly small lots.
how does that go? I'm sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead. Finish
well,
what you were gonna say.
the thing that's happening, as I mentioned in the neighborhoods, is the infill of younger people, higher income people who are occupying more new single-family houses and duplexes. And that's kind of coming from the Denver area from the north, and it's gradually kind of populating throughout the community. So I would say, probably, this is a wild guess from 2010, probably 700 or 800 multifamily units,
Okay.
and maybe 150, 200 between single family and duplexes and fourplexes and that type of thing. One of the things that's happening in Englewood is the gap between the affordability that they've enjoyed relative to the rest of the metro area is closing really rapidly. So one of the things that's been driving the development in the neighborhoods, especially on the housing side, is developers, even not very long before I arrived there, they could go in and spend $250,000 on a house.
What?
And scrape it, and now the average house is closing in on $400,000, and that's within 3 or so years. And so the market dynamics are changing in that the rapidity with which the new product, not the multifamily, but the stuff in the neighborhoods, we're seeing, again, for Englewood, this is big ticket prices, $500,000 to $750,000, which is a whole different demographic than what their next door neighbor may be. And so that's the pace of change has been pretty interesting. And as I said, at some points challenging to watch in parts of town, but we're dealing with a market economy. And I think folks have really seen on the development side, they've seen the value of being proximate to Denver, to the tech center, to the rail. That type of thing is a huge selling point. And that's driving some of what's going on down there.
Who else has a question out here? Let's get another, go ahead.
I have
What's your name?
Eugene Howard.
Eugene.
I also work at the City and County of Denver. So I have a kind of a complicated question because I think each of you can answer it. So I'm wondering about the incentives versus the expense of developing versus what we always do, and how, especially thinking about more suburban and suburban sprawl, how do we try to encourage a developer to think outside of their comfort zone to create projects that are more community focused, even if the community might be a little small, little piece of a larger community. What would be your advice on trying to kind of nudge or push? Because I think you just mentioned there's really nothing terribly wrong with a 7-Eleven, but if a community has 50 of them and they don't want any more, they really would like something else. How do we have that dance?
Is the context of a existing, like a redevelopment context or a new?
So it's a little bit of both. I'm thinking of a particular part of Denver where we're actually actively writing a plan. I'll just say it's in the far northeast area where there's like the last green space to develop in Denver. And it's suburbia, as far as Denver goes. And we have developers that really want to continue that suburban product because they know it, they can get it financed, all the things that you guys are quite familiar with.
Entitlement.
They have, cut, paste, change the name, and submit. So what would be your advice on how do we say, okay, you might want to cut and paste and change the name, but can you do a little bit more while you're at it? And what we're kind of encouraging in the direction that our plan is headed in is thinking about phasing over a longer period of time. So sure, do your traditional strip mall, but don't build it in such a way that it precludes something else 10 years from now.
So yeah, I think that's, one notion is that people, or the profession tends to think you can't build parking lots. But if you think about it in the context long-term, a parking lot is nothing but a holding pad for future development. So again, it's kind of, and I bring Corkit in pretty regularly when I can to look at some of these kind of sites. It's like, okay, we know it's not going to happen overnight, but how can we demise that area and then allow certain uses to be put in various parts of that area, but then allow still that opportunity for change with time there. So I think there's a lot of concern that, well, if you allow the parking lot's going to be there forever. And I think we've seen examples today where we've had these massive parking lots that are now primed for redevelopment because there's just an overabundance of it for these sites. So then the challenge is coming in to figure out, okay, what's the mechanism now to get somebody to be interested in that particular parcel from a redevelopment perspective there. So it's pretty complicated, you can't...
What would be an example, I just want to ask really quick, what would be an example of an improvement that you would like to see these guys do? Would it be, my question is, 7-Eleven, not 7-Eleven, I want to see 4 units, 8 units, 12 units, I want to see density. To me, my problem with the parking lot is that it's how much further I have to drive to get home. And it keeps, the more parking lots we have, the more we're giving over space and spreading things out further because we decided that cars were going to determine how everything's laid out.
Well, I think that's part of it. One of the conversations that we are having is with development rights. So development rights exist today that would allow a fair amount of density, but we're not getting that product.
Yeah.
Because they would, I'm speaking in very general terms, but it seems as if the developers that are at the table want to do what they're familiar with, as was mentioned earlier. So instead of doing the single-story sort of strip mall-ish suburban development, could we get the 2-story where there's the stuff on the bottom that everybody's already doing, but we get some residential or we get something else?
Maybe, it's a little hard without knowing the specific project, but I think often 2-story retail is overrated, even in the context of phenomenal urbanism. I think there's great, neighborhoods that have 1-story retail that are very walkable, very attractive. And so if it becomes more expensive and more complicated, the financing is more complicated, you're starting to mix and match professions at that point. Unless you find a mixed-use developer, it's probably down here in Denver somewhere. I would maybe just focus on the street layout and design. And, you know, I feel like when I go to like the suburbs, what makes me feel like it's a missed thing always is that they just didn't do the basic street block layouts in a way that
They could be.
can grow incrementally and that can change easily. And you know, you look at the neighborhoods between here and Cherry Creek, for example, and they're all, some of them are ripe for redevelopment, but the street network is really intact and it's at a good scale. And so maybe just like back to basics of like not doing these like really suburban designs for.
Wouldn't zoning allow you to say,
And I was just
well,
saying, let them do
this many units,
a lot
that's
of
it?
things.
Well,
Not
so
that easy.
here's the thing with that though.
Not that easy.
You know, I think,
They just
I've
go to
worked
the
in the
next
public
tab.
sector at municipal level, 3 communities in Colorado my entire career, and I think
Yeah.
what we tend to do is we impose our rules and we just, that's that, and we walk away. And I think one of the things that the local governments need to do is become a little bit more entrepreneurial, like these guys are at the front end with our regulations. So I have a really hard time, because these guys are always out there trying to bend the market to fill their product. And I think governments are tempted, some of them, to try to bend the market to fill space through incentives or whatever it may be. And when these guys fail, it only hurts them. When the local governments fail, it hurts everybody, especially political careers. That's why it's inherently hard for the governments to take that risk. And so from my perspective, I think Tony mentioned it, this idea of setting your vision, but not setting it to the point at which it's just dogma and it can never change and you're just going to wait them out because they can't bend the market unrealistically. We in the municipal sector, we can't do it either. So if you start to see the germs of something that's good, you take a look at your code and say, all right, what do we need to update it or freshen it to get more of that? Or less of something else that may have happened, so that we're adapting over time, so that these things aren't just adopted by our councils and our planning commissions, and they sit there for 15 and 20 years, and nothing ever happens. If you get the germ of something that's happening, go back to your code and try to exploit it.
So
I mean, that's where I think our risk and our entrepreneurial approach should be, is in the things that we fundamentally control, and that's the rules. And get out of the competition of everybody going after this.
So
Because if
was
you
your
do it right, you'll get these.
So was your concern more about the uses going in there, or
It's
the
less
actual building, the design?
It's less about the uses,
It's about.
I mean, that's a part of it,
Yeah.
but what I'm concerned about as a planner is if we continue to replicate what already exists, it's going to get in the way of what could be 5, 10, 20 years from now.
Well, and again, I think that's where you've got to kind of look at the parcel, kind of in the larger context, and how parcelize it, and then figure out what can fit in those parcels more to date, but also gives you the latitude. So in Longmont, for example, we have a long commercial strip, basically 287, where we have that situation. We have these buildings pushed way back. But we're looking at it now to say, okay, how can we somehow bifurcate that parcel to create these new themed development parcels that then gives us that development opportunity here on this particular piece here. So I think it's kind of, maybe that's part of it, just looking at the bigger picture, seeing how it fits in the context of that, and then get it cited accordingly that it protects your future interests. Because that's what it is. If you let them cite it, they're going to plop it, which is most advantageous to them. But it could be just like, guy, we just need you to move it 25 feet this way or that way,
Yeah.
because we want to preserve this vision in the future.
I would design the street system, the blocks, overlay them on all the parcels, no matter they're private or public.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to annex, this is the street system, this is what you have to build to. If you control the blocks, you're going to control the buildings for the most part.
And at least reserve the right-of-way for those blocks.
I think
Yeah,
it,
if you control, that's how they used to do it, and that's what you need to go back to, is control the street layout. And just do it over, everyone's private land, they want to annex it, this is a street, oh, we don't want to put that in, tough, you know?
I think when people are stuck in, I think one of the things that was brought up earlier was that density is more profitable.
Yeah,
You put
it's
3
definitely more
units,
profitable.
that's more, you shouldn't have to
But it
tell
could be-
somebody, I want you to make 30% more money. That shouldn't be an argument that you have to make to them. They should be asking you for
The
more
problem is
density.
density is usually very ugly in this country, so it is. So you
But
could do
so
it,
a lot of stuff is really ugly here.
well, but the problem, that's the aversion to it, is that it's ugly, it feels hostile, it's scary.
It's-
So remember my first
No,
part there?
Listen, there's ways to make it look good,
Oh,
and ways
yeah.
to do it right, and there's ways to just continue to allow it to unfold in a really ugly
And
fashion.
unfortunately, there's that politics piece of the equation that really, you've got to figure out how to address that, be sensitive to it. So I agree with Kiki, they go,
Yeah.
we want density, and all of a sudden you've got the community coming out and get glued about it, so.
Yeah, it's a dirty word, it's really not, but you can, if you go around, look around in high-density areas, like, oh yeah, that's not really good density there.
I think
Can I ask a very quick follow-up and then I'll stop? So if you're working, well, it sounds like maybe Buena Vista, you might have a little bit more say in where your streets go, but if someone came to you and said, move your street a little bit this way or that way, is that a conversation that you would entertain?
They do that to you, but to your detriment right now. Oh no, we don't want your streets to connect to the next subdivision. We don't want you to have 5 access points in your development. They do it to the detriment of the development. So, they're changing. Longmont's changed tremendously, just as I have since I started the project. The whole world has. So it's moving in the right direction, but you have the right as a jurisdiction to just say, this is where we have a street plan, it's for everybody, and if you don't violate it, you're approved today.
That's
It's
a
just,
good
you're
point.
approved by right, and if you're approved by right, I mean, that's a lot more attractive to developers than if you have to go through a 5-year process to get approved.
Right, so I think
Yeah.
to glue this together, so I think the character and scale and feel of your town will ultimately be determined largely by the network and the layout of that street, how big the blocks are, what the size of the streets are. That creates a huge part of that vision. And so I think if you guys were able to create that, and then on your end, this idea that these codes are not like, the law, they're guiding things that someone in the room has some ability to be like, yeah, I can work with you a little bit if you can help make this vision come real. We're not in the code room, as a developer, buyers come in and we have to make it work for them. We bend it to our vision, and then we take that to the town so that the buyer doesn't have to deal with it. So we do all the variances, all the special use permits. We fight the battle because the buyers doesn't want to deal with it, and maybe if a developer knew there is a vision that's pretty cool, and man, these guys are like, keeping the codes away from us and keeping our timelines efficient.
So, there's kind of a generational issues that, I used to say as people that went to school before 1985, 1990, that were the problem. It wasn't that they were the problem, it was just they were educated in a different way, and so you're fighting this institutional knowledge. And I just say, just have to outlive them, because everyone's getting re-educated and they're becoming, there's a lot more information available now. When I started, people didn't know how to build a courtyard house. I'd say, this courtyard house lot, well, what is that? Architects would ask me that, what is that? I said, what do you mean, what is that? Well, can you show me one? Let me go to the library and get a book. Here, this is what they are. But really, no, seriously, that's what it was. And so it was just, that institutional knowledge had got lost during, the Great Depression. It just disappeared. Builders took over. They started diluting the architecture over decades, and it just became what it is now.
The way we've always done it, what we point at and say, but that's the way we've always done it, isn't the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
It's the way we've done it since cars came around. There's thousands of years of cities being built before we got to this point, and the way we did it in those places, you can find a very good place, a very real, accessible human form. It's the places that were built after zoning, after cars.
But let me
They're a
say,
total wreck.
So-
they're a mess and they're deadly.
so in the planning professionals, especially some of the newer planning professionals, they're always designing with the thought that cars are never going to be an integral part of the development, and it's a challenge. So, this notion that cars are going away, I think that's something that has to be dismissed rather immediately. You've got to accommodate it somehow, and you've got to accommodate convenience of people utilizing those cars. So put in a parking lot, half a mile away, that ain't gonna help your businesses here. So I think there's some middle ground and some discussion
It's
about
tough.
that.
Is it more convenient to get in my car and drive a half a mile to a grocery store than to have a corner market that I can walk to for 9 out of 10 of those trips?
Well, younger people have that aspiration more than our generation, so.
And you will change it. You will change
The
I mean,
car-
we don't know, autonomous car,
The car, you do
whatever.
have to accommodate the car. I do believe
Yeah.
there's gonna be carpool, people are gonna end up buying cars as groups of four,
Yeah.
and they become robotic,
But they're
because
still
they'll just
there.
automatically go to people. So that'll probably diminish the need of them, but you always have to accommodate them, and you have to do it wisely in a way that,
Yeah.
you build the commercial buildings around a square, because of that becomes, at one point in 200 years, a real square,
Right, I
So-
mean, we don't use our transportation system in any sort of efficient way. How much carpooling do we do? How many people get,
Not in this country.
their groceries delivered? Like, if everyone in your neighborhood got their groceries delivered, that would cut down on dozens and dozens and dozens of dumb little trips that don't.
Robotic cars are gonna change.
So it actually doesn't cut down the number of trips, because that person still has to drive the delivery to your house.
But one
Your
delivery
personal
van,
trip goes
one
away.
delivery
Efficiency comes
van
from
can
robotic
deliver
cars.
groceries to 40
It's
people
the
instead
ro-
of 40 people
The
making an
robotic car is
individual
gonna
trip.
make it much more efficient, because
Yeah.
it will be in service 24/7.
People still gravitate towards places that weren't bent over backwards and broken over a car. I mean, that's where people go. That's why Larimer Square is always hopping. Placemaking is hard to do if it's just a place for cars.
So, me and Mark more recently worked on a project where, actually, I was pushing for less parking than what he was saying we should have, so.
Well,
I gotta run.
thanks so much.
Enjoy the show.
All right,
Oh,
enjoy.
That was a great
Enjoy the
talk.
Very educational.
Thanks a lot.
We could really rock
There we go,
this
forever.
Q&A for a long time.
It's a great
Well, we
time.
had one and then.
The world's changing, and people like y'all are changing, so.
Well, the crowd is fizzling out, so
Thanks
thanks
a
a lot
lot
for
for their homework.
All right.
Thank you.
That was great. I
Don't let
can't
them
tell you
change you.
how much I appreciate it.
Thanks for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really wonderful.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks. Sorry to jump out. But,
Enjoy the concert.
Yeah.